You're saying that the pillared mosques, the pillars which they used in mosques, they were brought from outside and put in place. It looks improbable because a prefabricated pillar used elsewhere in some other place, how can it fit into a new building with such accuracy? How it can be architecturally fitted. It looks improbable.
Well, it may sound so, but this is the reality. And if you study the building in detail, I think there are many places where there were adjustments made. And the entire conception of height and other things were done in order to match this kind of assemblies. So this is a kind of established, a tradition and a fact that this is something, and historians have worked on this, that this is something, which is possible only. I don't get the full slide. I don't get the full. Sorry. I will do that. Yeah. You can see in this particular case, there are in no two pillars, the heights are same. And when it comes to the level where they established the roof, it is at that level that they really made the residual adjustments.
So, raise a question, please come over here and raise.
Wonderful as it is, sir, how did they ensure the stability of these wonderful structures? Because over the centuries, the place must have, the entire region must have experienced quakes, earthquakes, and things like that.
Yes.
But in spite of all that, we still have retained those structures.
You see, one of the most important aspect was, as I said earlier, that in Indian temple architecture, there were only two forces. One was horizontal and the other one was vertical. There was no arcuated system ever in temple architecture. And that's why the structures always became, balanced by the gravity. And the loads, that took were enormous, you see, because the stones were also of that size when it came to spanning. And when it came to domical, construction, they always once again went only corbelling horizontal courses and not making an arch.
Okay.
So arch was always something, which was a destabilizing element. And in our construction, there was no such practice of introducing third force.
Okay.
So in that sense, Indian temple construction differed from the Islamic.
That they have lasted for centuries
Yes.
speaks volumes about
Yes,
the structural
absolutely.
stability they ensured in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. It was, this could be another lecture of the Sompura's abilities, to sort of understand and, work in the field of construction. Because I think it is something, which they inherited in terms of their own traditional knowledge. So this is something, which is fascinating. And you must understand that the minars fell down. The minars above the facade, they fell down. Because as they went up, they became slender structures. And they could not really withstand the lateral force of the earthquake.
Anyone wanting to ask a question? Please, you come over to the stage.
There was one thing which I would like to sort of expand a bit between these two communities or two different religious approaches. Ahmedabad, the city, had 28 such monuments in the small area of 5.5 square kilometer. The entire planning, the planning which started was with the fort, which was on the bank of the river, the main mosque, which was Jami Masjid, and the places for the tombs of the king and the queens. So after doing that initial planning, the entire, settlement planning was left to the wisdom of the communities by the ruler. And it is also something, which is of great interest, that when it came to Muslim settlements, they had a mosque which was for their day-to-day use in maximum 200-meter radius of the residences. And Jain temples were also similar. In fact, you'll be surprised that there were about more than 450 Jain temples in this little area, because every settlement or every pole would have their own temple. And similarly, the mosque, for every, Muslim settlement. So these two things coexisted very well, because it was also the planning principles were according to their canons, that the width of the street, the length of the street, they were all mentioned. They are all mentioned. And there is an Egyptian scholar who has worked on this, that the width should be such that two persons coming from opposite side can observe each other's face. And that actually developed the community bondage. And it was same in Jains. But additionally in Jains, their houses opened on the streets. So there was a kind of constant touch with anyone who passes by. And there was a time to sort of spend your free time towards the street, so that there is a kind of exchange and communications between the families. Now, these kind of canonical things were in a sense quite common for both the communities, but in their own way. And that was also one way that the entire settlement pattern became very homogeneous and very, very much similar to each other. So this is also one point of a possible acceptance, mutual acceptance of the communities, in terms of planning the city. So it not only extended only up to the level of this building and the attributes, but also in planning the whole city, that there was this kind of cultural, sort of similarities which was there. And the biggest thing about the communities was that they were all mostly involved in trade and commerce. So the culture of the city was essentially the economic gain. And they were, in that sense, no religion really mattered. So because their objective was common to successfully do trade and commerce, and in that everyone was a partner, irrespective of their religion. And this tradition is something which is continuing for last 600 years, and it is still going on. And the Muslim philanthropists, when they offered something to the city, they never looked for any kind of difference between the communities. And it is the same when the Jain philanthropist or Baniyas, when they offered something, they never looked at religion. So this is the ethos, of the culture of the city. And this is also what we actually tried to emphasize as the intangible culture of the city, which has coexisted. So this is where I think your emphasis on the plurality of culture is something, which becomes very important to understand.
Sir, I have a question. Specialty about Sun Temple, Konark, and
no, that's very different.
Okay.
But I can
any architectural influence on that, and can you kindly throw some light on that?
No, say it again. What exactly is your question?
So what is so specialty about the Sun Temple of Konark, and do you have any architectural influence which is magnificent, that has enhanced its glory? Can you kindly throw some light on that?
First and foremost, sorry. The first and foremost, the temple that you see today, it's only a mandap. It's not really the temple. It's a mandap, which is with those rathas. The main temple was attempted. It was never built because the scale was so large in terms of an Orison temple that they could really never undertake the construction fully. And that's why you will see many, many parts are lying there in the surroundings, you know. And I think it's a huge and massive scale, and I think Nikhil knows better than I do. The Konark temple, because he has been sort of also observing this very closely with the ASI people. The scale is enormous. I think in order to protect it, the British filled it up with sand, so you can't enter that building, but it is filled up because they thought that it might collapse. So in order to, avoid that kind of eventuality, they thought it better to fill it up with sand, so it doesn't really collapse. So this is something, in terms of the idiom of architecture, I think it is very different because Orison temple architecture is quite a specific, type of temple architecture, which is, sort of in the manner of the cult, which is the Jagannath, and the construction technique also is very different. So, I mean, one can go on talking about this, but it's a very different kind of example.
So this might be a broad question, but probably you could highlight some significant aspects. So if we talk of cultural diffusion, as you've expressed through architecture of Gujarat Sultanate, is there something specific which you would like to highlight as which is seen specifically in the cultural fusion here versus the Delhi Sultanate, where the third force, comes into exploration as expressed through architecture, or any other part of India? Like, what was specific about this fusion?
Wherever you see the pure Islamic traditions, you will see this, because their construction methods were very different, including starting from Bahmani, which I think also Nikhil has documented very well. If you go and see, for example, Bidar, and if you see the buildings there, it distinctly stands as Islamic buildings in a situation there. Although within the proximity of this tremendously rich, architecture of Karnataka, and its earlier empires. So, including Delhi, you see, because any layer of Delhi Sultanate you pick up, I think they depended on their own craftsmen. They never took, even the local craftsmen were trained to only work in that sense. Mehrauli is the best example, because even in palace in Mehrauli, I think if you see very carefully, I think there is nothing, which you can say is Rajput. But if you contrast that with Fatehpur Sikri or even Red Fort, you will immediately see that there are influences which are accepted. So, wherever there were this Sultanate architecture and Sultanate, rulers in different parts of the country, in most places they really tried to hold on to their own identities. They even brought the forces with them to work. They found material, which was, sort of compatible to their kind of expertise. But it is only in Gujarat that they adopted local traditions, local material, and indigenous techniques. So this is something, even this mosque, which I'm showing you, they appear to be stone buildings, but it is only facing. Internally, if you see even the great wall that they have made in Jami Masjid, the wall, the core of the wall is mass brick masonry. It's only in the surface that they have used stones in order to show their familiarity with the material which, they considered was their own, So this is something, which is a very specific case.
So, sir, what are the factors that led to this massive adaptation? What were the reasons that this happened more in this region than other regions where they brought in their own original? What
thing was that I think the first thing was the way they came in was through trade and commerce. The way Muslims came to Gujarat was essentially through trade and commerce. If you read the chronicles of that period, or even the chronicles written later, it tells you that from Middle East, the Muslims came towards the Gujarat coast as traders and merchants. But they came with an agenda that they have to settle there and ultimately establish. So this is a very interesting part of the history, that one can really read through.
So is it okay to say that when they come through conquest, then it's
they
a
never
sort of a
came
different
to they never
other regions like Delhi and
that was a very different story.
But when it's through trade and commerce, it's more
here
about
it was the the Muslims came here first, and then they supported Muslim rule with the rulers which were prominent here, who were chieftains basically. Even Ahmad Shah's grandfather, was actually a Rajput. His name was Sadharan, and he had a brother whose name was Som. They converted. They did very well in the earlier army of the Subedar. And because he was impressed with him, he took him to the Delhi Sultans and appointed them as the Subedars. And they had to convert for that, and they did that. So if you in a way see the entire lineage of the Sultans of Gujarat was essentially a Rajput convert, and his generations. So this is something, which is very different in Gujarat. Gujarat Muslims never came essentially to conquer. No ruler came here. It was only in 15th century that the Sultanate got a proper ruler. So this is a very interesting part of history, and that is where the trade and commerce idea and the culture of trade and commerce is something, which has always been ingrained in the entire, ethos of a Gujarati. That's why, even Gujarati poets have, mentioned that a Gujarati spirit is such that wherever he goes, he establishes a Gujarat. So that's a very, very, very different kind of a culture. And I think one has to really understand this in order to understand the fusion of architecture or, other arts.